So my name is Shalini Gupta with the Center for Earth, Energy, and Democracy. We're based in Minneapolis. And our organization has a core belief in the principle of democracy. And when it comes to climate change, that means that the communities that are going to be most impacted by climate change have to be at the decision-making table and be at the forefront of the solutions. And as we know, that climate change isn't going to be experienced equally. And so our organization really started to provide tools and capacity building for initiatives to support these communities. And so as we know from Katrina and Sandy, that there is a socioeconomic lens to climate change impacts. And how are we integrating that into adaptation planning and this concept of climate resiliency that we're talking about here today? So, so our organization works on climate and energy and environmental policy, and we do a lot on, as I was talking about, tools development. And a question we've really been also grappling with is how do we really define vulnerability and resiliency, the question at hand today. So one way a lot of people have talked about and that you'll hear about in this conference is sort of this endpoint method. And that's sort of an approach of many policy planning efforts. And that's where existing health conditions are the baseline for an assessment, right? And climate-related impacts are measures as additional risk to that baseline, right? So it looks at an existing community and what are the health impacts. And then if there's a climate impact, like increased flooding, or you have increased heat index days, what is the impact to that community? But as we know, science isn't necessarily going to understand everything, right? The modeling to date on whether climate change is occurring or not is just in its infancy right now, right? And so in terms of what its actual impacts might be on a certain coastal area, on a certain community, right? The modeling is just starting. There's been a lot of modeling happening in terms of, is climate change really happening? But in terms of the impacts, the modeling is in its infancy. So in the face of that, what does that mean? How do we act in the absence of this knowledge? So how do we really build the health and viability of a community? Communities are vulnerable because of things like legacy pollution, cumulative impacts, and historic structural inequalities. And only by addressing that do we really create climate resiliency, right? So in terms of cumulative impacts, how many people here know what cumulative impacts is? Okay, a few. Okay, so cumulative impacts, we're talking about a community. So in the cases of when Hurricane Sandy hit, right, a lot of communities there, when there was flooding, were dealing with migration of toxic pollution because of the land, the brownfields, that their residential neighborhoods were sited near. And so if you have flooding of a toxic area and that water sits, the concern there was, is that toxicity migrating into residential neighborhoods, right? And so in terms of cumulative impact, when you talk about a community is already vulnerable, we've seen what in some of the images coming out of Katrina and Sandy. What it means, though, is that it basically means that there's a concept of overburdened communities, okay? So you have areas that have multiple facilities sited due to a legacy of zoning, right? Industrial zoning that was there for a long time. And so each facility, chemical facilities, you have power plants, are sited in similar neighborhoods, right? In the same neighborhood in many instances, where each individual facility is completely legal according to state law and permitting. But they're all sited in the same place. And so every facility is legal, but when you put them all together, there is an overburdening of that community. And so this creates what we call hotspots, right? Hotspots of a community being overburdened. And then when you add that to already existing vulnerabilities of a community experiencing crime, experiencing differentiated access to health, economic burden, you have a situation where when added climate impacts are happening, you actually have a community that is starting at a very different place in terms of resiliency. Okay, So where we're based in Minneapolis, we developed an EJ mapping tool where basically looking at multiple levels of data, county, city, state level data. What do I mean by these communities? We're not all starting in the same place, right? When a tornado hits, when high urban heat island days, heat days hit, communities are not starting in the same place. So when you look at two neighborhoods in Minneapolis based on existing data, you have neighborhood A and neighborhood B. What is their sort of current basis of where we're talking about their resiliency basis? So this is neighborhood A has population density of 11 people per acre. Neighborhood B has 3 people per acre, so lower density in neighborhood B. Neighborhood A has 75% or more percentage people of color, and neighborhood B has 10% or less. Okay? These neighborhoods are about a mile apart in Minneapolis. So the same neighborhoods in terms of contaminated sites. So MPCA is our Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. In terms of contaminated sites of these two neighborhoods, the higher density neighborhood has 44 contaminated sites per acre, higher percentage of people of color, versus approximately 8 sites per acre in terms of contaminated sites, so toxic brownfield sites. Okay? And then when you think about what we keep hearing about in terms of green infrastructure, right, as ways of gaining more resiliency in some of these high weather-related impacts. In neighborhood A, you have 3.8% existing tree canopy, higher density, higher people of color. Neighborhood B, you have 42% of existing tree canopy. In parkland, 6.4 acres of parkland within a 9-minute walk in neighborhood A, 280 acres. So parkland also has a lot of those ecosystem benefits, right, we're talking about, but all in terms of creating resiliency. So in terms of access to infrastructure, existing infrastructure, and what that means for sort of future resiliency to climate, there's a huge differentiation that is based on historic policies and settlement patterns in a lot of our communities. So we can't just sort of come to resiliency from like a basic sort of static point of like how are these communities, yes, these are vulnerable communities, but there's a history of policy and public practice that has created this as well. And so how do we start to create the resiliency of these communities and building of resources and infrastructure? So we look at, in terms of a healthy, sustainable community and what a resilient community really is when these extreme situations hit, what does that mean? It means a lot of different things, right? It means in terms of what is the air quality, because we know air quality is going to be impacted with climate change. It means food access. It means access to good housing, transportation, community. A lot of these energy in terms of how they all integrate to make a community resilient, right? If you think about your own community, how do these different aspects try to integrate to make a community resilient? So I'm going to use the example of energy. So in terms of energy, what we know is that prices are expected to rise, right? This is the history of prices rising. You have natural gas being the red, the orange is retail electricity. And we know with climate change policies that are going to be enacted, there is going to be likely a rise in, as our infrastructure transitions, a rise in energy prices, right? That's what's been projected. This is going to have an income impact, right? So you have a situation where we call energy burden, where people that are, families that are at the poverty level are paying about 17% of their income to pay their energy bills. And families that are at about 200% of the poverty level are paying about 7%. So significantly less of their income to pay their energy bills. So if we're faced with a situation where future climate policies are going to be increasing energy prices in order to mitigate climate change, there's going to be a disproportionate impact on low-income communities. how we decide to approach that matters, right? A lot of the conversation now is, as we're developing mitigation policies, is around rate relief, is around how do we actually provide money to help people pay their bills. That's where a lot of the conversation's happening right now. Well, we would argue that, yes, that is very important, but those are highly underfunded programs. They never meet the needs, and especially if we're expected that energy prices are continuing to rise. In addition, how do we start thinking about actual technology transfer into low-income communities to meet, to counter this? So for the Twin Cities, so this is Minneapolis, St. Paul. You have Minneapolis here, and this is St. Paul, so the Twin Cities. And so we've developed a energy vulnerability indicator that basically looks at multiple factors. It's the first time in the United States that such an indicator has been developed, which starts to actually look at what are the energy needs of a community, and how does that factor into it can look into what is the type of housing stock, income, various factors. And so this map is basically a visualization of this indicator, and the red and orange areas show high energy vulnerable areas. So these are communities that have a high energy burden, that have a high risk of not being able to pay their bills. And so where are energy resources going? Are we actually going, are they going to these communities or not? And most of the millions of dollars that have gone into energy efficiency and renewables, a lot of solar dollars have gone to communities that are ready to receive them so far. And so those are usually communities, they're targeted towards home ownership, they're targeted towards areas that have good credit and that have housing stock that people have had access to capital to continue maintenance. And so these blue areas, which are actually the low energy vulnerable areas that are not paying a significant share of their income right now for energy, is where a lot of that new technology has gone, the energy efficiency technology and the solar technology, which is actually creating a larger gap. So between these neighborhoods, right? And so a lot of the new green technology is going into these areas. And so how do we start to think about that, especially when we're talking about climate resiliency, where you have a transmission grid that could be impacted due to higher sort of extreme weather situations in rural communities, who has access to distributed generation resources and can be more resilient in the case of a power outage, right? And who actually is able to be more resilient in terms of even having the income and economic capacity to bounce back. If you're paying 17% of your income to energy bills, that definitely makes it harder. And if all the technology and resources are going to outlying communities that already have high resiliency factors, you're actually creating a greater sort of disparity in terms of resiliency. So this is the same, this is again Minneapolis and St. Paul. The orange areas, outlined areas, are those high vulnerability, energy vulnerability areas I was talking about. And that indicator doesn't include race. And so when we talk, we've been hearing a lot about sort of access to cities for resources, for resiliency. We have to go even at a more granular level in terms of neighborhood politics, right? A lot of our cities are highly segregated, right? Chicago, Minneapolis, New York. We have highly segregated cities in terms of race and income. And so you have to look at a more granular level. So here, if you underlay the race of Minneapolis and St. Paul, the racial makeup of Minneapolis, St. Paul, the higher percentage of people of color are in the darker areas. And what you'll see is that there's a high correlation. There is a racial correlation with high energy vulnerable areas and race. And so we point this out because even a lot of policies and programs related to energy don't necessarily have, they're kind of a come one, come all sort of strategy. And even though they don't have a race-based sort of explicit lens, if all the resources for efficiency and energy resiliency are going to these areas, you by de facto actually are having a racial impact to a policy, right? A lot of policies don't state that, but there is racial ramifications that are happening. And so you're getting not only a disparity in terms of the green infrastructure by income, you are getting it by race as well. So when we think about energy and community resiliency, one thing we're looking at is how do we get our biggest bang for our buck in terms of mitigation and adaptation? And so if communities of color, low-income communities, as we know, are going to be the most impacted by climate change, and those are the target areas for building resiliency. With limited resources, we know, that are there, how can we possibly couple mitigation and adaptation together? And so this is a map of, in Minneapolis and St. Paul, public facilities that exist, so like that are high use by community. Libraries, community centers, schools, that are also going to be used as cooling centers, right? Heating centers for Minnesota, very important. Those areas where the public goes for emergency situations, right? So one, these are the spaces that should be invested in from a resiliency and adaptation standpoint. These are vulnerable communities. If you think about where the high energy vulnerability areas were, and what public facilities are located in those areas that are going to be used for emergency shelters, let's invest our energy resources, our solar distributed generation resources in the communities that have the high energy vulnerability, right? That need the energy resiliency, that need those investments and resources that have historically not received them in order to build their resiliency up. And at the same time, what we're doing is investing in mitigation as well. Because you're putting that green technology, that green energy technology, there where it doesn't matter, right? Where the CO2 emissions reductions come from. But with adaptation, resiliency, even though with mitigation, place doesn't matter, with adaptation, resiliency, place matters, right? Each community is going to be hit differently. They have a different story in terms of their resiliency landscape. And so how do we start to couple that intersection of both mitigation and adaptation? So I'll end there. Thank you.